The Iranians are firing all of their older missiles. And by older missiles, I mean old technology. And the old technology is being shot down, which is the goal. They want the Israelis to waste all of their inventory on these old missiles before they start using the really high end, devastating material. So I think this is just the beginning. The other part of this is that we're now going to see the rest of the world sort of link arms around Iran. Because if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing or Ankara or anywhere else and you see what's happening to Iran, you say, well, look, if we don't stand by these people, inevitably we'll be next. You know, we'll just be one more dead name on the list like Gaddafi. So I think all in all, this is a catastrophe for Israel. I was not entirely surprised at what the Israelis did, but I was surprised that we were complicit in it. We seem to have deliberately lulled the Iranians into a situation where they thought there was still going to be another round of talks and that there was still some possibility of a settlement, when in reality, it's pretty clear we decided that that was not the case. And whether we intended it at the very top or this is something that happened without the complete knowledge and understanding of the president, I don't know. But the point is that we are now in a terrible position because no one in the world believes anything we say. But I think they're looking for the B-2s to show up at very high altitude where they think they can bomb with impunity to attack these facilities. And they hope that this will rescue Israel from its current position, because Israel's position grows weaker by the day and Iran's grows stronger. Why? Because Iran's arsenal of missiles isn't quite inexhaustible, but pretty damn close. They're not going to run out of missiles. They're not going to run out of support. And they've got plenty of supplies and technical assistance pouring into the country from many, many different locations, not just in the Middle East, but also Russia, China, North Korea. There may be others that we don't know about. Iran's position grows stronger every day in the international arena. More and more countries are coming over to Iran's cause. Initially, it's psychological. Over time, it will become more material. Israel's position is the opposite. Israel is increasingly isolated, and it cannot withstand these onslaughts on its own. Remember, every time you fire a missile at a particular target that's incoming, in other words, we're talking about air defense missiles, it's habitual that you fire 2 or 3 missiles against every one missile that is aimed at you. Well, you're going to run out of missiles pretty quickly. And Israel's very small. It's smaller than the state of New Jersey. And Iran is the size of Western Europe. And there are more than 90 million people living in Iran. So while Israel can certainly make life miserable for Iran, it can do a lot of damage. And of course, it always has nuclear warheads. And if it decides that it needs to use a nuclear warhead in order to win its war, that's very dangerous, because at that point, I would be very surprised if nuclear warheads did not show up in Tehran. Let's get back to reality. Iran is a nation of 90 million. It's the size of Western Europe. It has thousands upon thousands of missiles. How do you weaken that? You can temporarily disrupt it. You can suppress it for a short time. But we've discovered pretty clearly that, short of the use of a nuclear weapon, and that's not an impossibility, that Iran is absolutely, I would argue, unbeatable. I think what you might see in the future is, as Israel weakens and is subject to more and more destructive impact from Iran, and as Iran's position in the international community grows stronger, that the Israelis may well tell us, if we can't survive and you're not going to help us, we'll use a nuclear weapon. That could happen. We would not want that to happen, clearly. But that's something they could threaten us with. That could happen, especially as Israel's position weakens. Israel's in a terrible position right now. Israel can't easily replace its losses. And as I said, Israel is, by comparison with Iran, a postage stamp. I don't think Israel would be doing what it's doing right now if it wasn't reasonably confident that it has control of the White House and the Congress. They think they've got control of President Trump, that when he's presented with this fait accompli, Israel is in a fight for its life. This is an existential fight for Israel. You have to come and help us, that he will do so. Perhaps he will. I don't know. That's the assumption, because President Trump must surely understand that if we become directly involved, the temptation for many other states to do so is overwhelming, not the least of which are Russia and China, as well as other states and virtually all the Muslim states in the region. Now, why would this be? Because I think people look at what's happening and they say, well, if we don't come to the aid of this country and prevent it from being destroyed by the United States, then we'll be next on the menu. Remember, they're not fools. They know that there are a lot of people in London, in the banking industry, in the financial industry, as well as in Washington and New York City, who very much want control of the oil fields in the Middle East. The question is, if we go into this with the goal of destroying Iran and ultimately getting control of these oil and gas fields, how close do we come to a direct confrontation with Russia and China, North Korea, and any number of other states? We don't know, but it's a very dangerous position to take. You can only bully and humiliate people to a certain point, and then they stand up and fight back. So I'm very concerned that this thing could rapidly run out of control. You know, Clausewitz used to say, before you start a war, you'd better understand what kind of war you're really fighting. And I think the Israelis thought that they could bully Iran more easily, they could suppress it more easily, they could be successful in their efforts to disrupt and bludgeon Iran than they were. They miscalculated. Iran has recovered. It's growing stronger. This is going to get worse, not better. So that was a bad miscalculation. Now they're falling back, as perhaps they always intended to in any case, on the United States. The United States normally doesn't like to intervene in things unless we can dictate the outcome. We like to impose solutions. We can't do that. The Russians won't sign up for it. Neither will the Chinese. And by the way, I don't think most of the Europeans will. So I think this is a very dangerous time. And that's why I wrote in this X that I sent out a proposal for a great power peace conference. We need the United States to sit down with Russia, China, India, Brazil, these great powers, and help arbitrate the situation. We need to put a stop to what's happening in Gaza. If anybody thinks that this is in isolation from Gaza, they're wrong. The Israeli contempt for human life in Gaza, their readiness to murder and starve tens of thousands of human beings, even millions to death, is something that has profoundly affected the whole world except the United States. The Iranians will not deliberately attack any U.S. positions in the region unless we directly intervene. Now, they know that we've given plenty of help and assistance to the Israelis. That's not really open to debate. But why would you want to give Washington an excuse to come in full force against you? That would be very stupid. And I think the Iranians are sensitive to that. They will stick to their current approach, which is to focus their attacks on Israel. Israel has no chance whatsoever of reducing Iran to rubble unless it uses a nuclear weapon. And if it uses a nuclear weapon, it risks having nuclear weapons used against it. And those nuclear weapons can come from any number of nuclear armed states. I think the Israelis know that. And so they're going to refrain from that. Although, as I pointed out earlier, in any last bit attempt to drag us into this war on their behalf to achieve their aims with our military power, they may threaten to use a nuclear weapon. You know, that's a nightmare. That's the last thing in the world that we in the United States want, or for that matter, anywhere else on the planet. But it's something that the Israelis will do if they, or threaten to do if we don't do as they wish. In fact, I've heard people argue that it is one contiguous front that starts along the border between Russia and Ukraine and runs all the way down to the border between Iran and the rest of its neighbors. In other words, you can't see these as completely separate and distinct. They are linked. The Russians know that. And the Russians are not going to let Iran die on the vine. They're not going to let it be destroyed. Russia looks at Iran, and remember, Russia is at the center of the Eurasian landmass. The Caucasus Mountains and Central Asia are Russia's soft underbelly strategically, much as Mexico is the soft underbelly for the United States. What Russia does not want is a regime in power anywhere in the Caucasus or in Iran that is fundamentally hostile to Russian national interest. Russia wants to build out this Belt and Road proposition for the same reasons China does. They want access to resources, they want to do business. It's a commercial project, but that commercial project would be destroyed and would harm Russia irrevocably on an economic level if Iran's nation statehood were to be weakened and its government were to be destroyed. Russia needs strong allies in the Caucasus and in Iran. So it's not going to allow, for its own reasons, strategically, that area of the world to fall into hostile hands. China is also behind Russia and is not going to allow Iran to go down for all the reasons we've discussed. If President Trump understands what you and I are discussing right now and how the potential for war is real, not just a local conflict between Iran and Israel, but a regional conflict that could actually become global. If he understands that, and that's made clear to him, I think he will keep us out. He will simply tell the Israelis, you made a mistake. Mr. Erdogan is probably a little too clever. He sat on the fence for a long time, playing both sides to the middle in his desire to aggrandize Turkish power. And we see that in Syria. And one wonders what Erdogan will do. He's subsequently come out and aligned himself with Iran. And Turkey is the real regional power, I would argue. They have the largest army in NATO. Their armed forces are very potent. The Israelis could not stand up to an attack from the Turks. And they're aware of that danger now. They didn't used to be aware of it, but now they are. I don't know what the Turks will do. They're a wild card. But at some point, I would be surprised if they did not intervene. Again, this is why President Trump needs to convene a great power conference, not stand up and say, I'm declaring peace, do as I say, but rather we need an immediate ceasefire. He needs to go to the United Nations Security Council, something which most people that work for President Trump loathe and despise. Go in there and ask the Security Council to back a ceasefire. Demand that the Israeli ceasefire and Iran ceases fire. We need to make it clear that we are not interested in the destruction of Iran any more than we want to see Israel be destroyed. And then ask for this great power conference. But we've also got to step in and demand an immediate end to the destruction wrought in Gaza. Stop this pointless loss of life. So remember, they talk about how weak Iran is. Iran is not as weak as they think. In fact, it's actually turned out to be quite strong. And then secondly, it is Israel that is dangerously weak. If things were going so well and Iran was so weak, why would the Israelis be begging us to come into the war on their side?